But before we open up to questions, I'll invite Charlotte Cadell from InterPariss to tell us a little bit about what signing off the anti-racism framework has meant for InterPariss and the process of organizational change that you've been on, and any learnings that you'd like to share. So over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Adet. And I think I heard earlier that I'm joining you as co-ed of Equitas shortly, perhaps.
That would be great, actually. That would be fantastic. I don't know if InterPariss would be that happy, but that'd be great.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here among these panelists today, and I really appreciated what I've heard from my co-panelists thus far. I'm going to position InterPariss involvement with ARC and our contributions to developing the framework and the survey and our decision to sign on within actually a longer and kind of larger scale look at our own internal process around anti-racism and anti-oppression. And so in order to do that, I'm actually going to take us back a good ways to when InterPariss was founded. InterPariss is Latin. The name is Latin for among equals, and we were founded in the 70s as an organization based on anti-colonial analysis and a vision of being not Northern actors imposing solutions or coming in as white Western saviors of people and communities in the global South, but rather working together as equals to uplift and support and learn from locally rooted activists and civil society in their own efforts of social transformation. And as such, our approach to international cooperation has always been one of solidarity, not charity. A critique of North-South power relations has always been central to our work, and so too has a recognition of the need for accountability of ourselves in our own Northern context and the need to advocate for social justice at home. So in ways, anti-racism has always been embedded in our approach. We have always been focusing on addressing the root causes of systemic injustice. We have always approached our work with analysis of power differentials, of systemic oppression, of exploitation of countries within the global South by actors in the global North. However, the language of racism and anti-racism was not explicitly the lens or the language we were using at this time. At the same time, most of the founders of InterPariss were white, cis, straight men. And so this perspective did dominate or influence, I should say, the approach we took in these early years. Over time, more feminists came on board, feminists of both genders came on board, and our analysis settled into anti-capitalist feminism. And so race and class were part of this analysis, and staff members were working with racialized communities outside of the organization, developing programming that addresses racism and movements led by racialized people, as well as being intentional about how we represented ourselves in the world and what kind of images we used in our fundraising and communications and public engagement that was external facing. Looking inward, however, our staff was still nearly all white, and our institutional culture reflected this. InterPariss is unique in that we operate on a co-management structure. And so among equals is not just the principle by which we do our programming, it's a principle for how we operate internally. We practice parity of salary and parity of responsibility. All full-time staff are involved in collectively managing the institution, and all major institutional decisions are made by consensus. And so our HR processes have always reflected this commitment to equality and to recognizing these individual needs, but they haven't always reflected how our needs and participation are shaped by social location. And the ways in which we did have awareness of this was very reflective of who was around the table at the time. by the mid 80s, it was absolutely a shared priority for us to have our politics and our values baked into every element of our institutional practice, yet there was still a bias there on what was on our radar in terms of enacting our politics and what was not. So we had among us strong feminist analysis that brought us to prioritize things like having a dependence allowance for caregiving staff as part of our salary structure. We have for a long time had queer staff, and so that informed our HR policies around family and family leaves to always support diverse family structures. But there were also major spots of ignorance, and we weren't necessarily making the same sort of policy and structural interventions on issues of race or in support of racialized staff. So I'm going to fast forward quite a bit now to 2013, when we undertook a diversity and anti-oppression audit. And this was one of our, I don't want to say first, but it was a significant institutional milestone in terms of prioritizing and resourcing our commitment to diversity and anti-oppression. Looking back at it 7 years after completing the audit, it is humbling to see how some of the dreams, if you will, that the audit identified, or goals and recommendations, have still not been achieved. And I feel you, Bella, when you're talking about the need to balance capacity and to prioritize, and the ways in which this work can be neglected within a smaller staff and a smaller organization. A barrier that was identified when we did the audit, and one that continues to be a factor, is competing organizational priorities. We did make progress in some key areas, but I think by and large for the last few years have felt frustrated with how our efforts seemed ad hoc or sporadic. When we had time, we would engage in a learning moment. When the opportunity arose, we might attempt to implement a new policy or take up an advocacy initiative, but there wasn't a systemic and sustained mechanism for engaging in anti-racism and anti-oppression work. The most progress that we have made as an organization on equity is around hiring and staffing, and integrating considerations into our hiring procedures to diversify our staff complement. And we've implemented new measures and experimented with different procedures, with some success and with and sometimes without. But this flip side of focusing so much on staff complement and human resources is that there's been a disproportionate focus on who is around the table, with less focus on other aspects of institutional culture and concrete changes to our institutional processes and procedures. This has also, I think, had a hindering effect in some ways on our anti-racism and anti-oppression work, as white colleagues have I think, sometimes failed to see how they can participate in furthering anti-racism and anti-oppression for the organization. And I think it takes away from an understanding that the work of anti-racism, the work of challenging white supremacy, is actually very much the work of white people. It's necessary work for white people. I will also say that there's a limitation to focus on bringing diverse voices to the table, and it's not enough for us or for any organization to do this without also implementing concrete mechanisms to support diverse voices once they get there, and to challenge ourselves to think about more systemic and structural change, should there even be a table, if you will. So in the last couple of years, we have been feeling, as Rob and Bella both spoke to, and I think as so many of us have, an increasing sense of urgency to act on anti-racism. In early 2020, we agreed to develop a work plan that would set goals across all aspects of the institution. And I have to give credit to OCIC for their anti-oppression policy and policy monitoring framework, which for a while has been a kind of guiding beacon for us, an example of how an organization can really codify its anti-racism work. But then there was a global pandemic, and that was a bit disruptive. And so this work slowed, and it really gained new life when conversations began shortly afterwards with Cooperation Canada to form an anti-racism platform. And so my colleague, Maritou Diallo, has been an active member on the task force and now the advisory committee that's contributed to the development and now implementation of this framework. And organizationally, we're able to use this platform as a base to scaffold our own institutional efforts around anti-racism and anti-oppression. It's also built shared momentum of this joint sectoral initiative that has allowed us to move our work plan ahead, to prioritize capacity for this work, and to start collaborating with our board of directors. Our contributions to the baseline report certainly identified some gaps in terms of our own institutional anti-racism and anti-oppression initiatives. A couple key pieces that came up were that we lacked a broad spectrum of HR policies and education and training interventions that were asked about in the survey. We also realized that we don't track our internal demographics, which has sparked some tough questions. And I appreciated someone bringing this up in the Q&A earlier about how to track internal demographics in a small staff team and also respect people's desire to disclose or not disclose and maintain confidentiality. We've also identified a gap in mechanisms for confidential feedback, both within and outside the organization. There were also areas in which our approach was just different than some of the initiatives that were proposed in the survey. So for example, there were a number of operational policies we were asked about that we don't implement because it's not conducive to our co-management process. So it's interesting to see how there can be shared values, but very different ways among organizations to implement them. So we have an internal anti-oppression committee, a staff committee that's now engaging with these considerations and thoughts sparked by completing the ARC baseline survey, as well as furthering our work on our emerging anti-racism and anti-oppression work plan. We're developing a plan with 6 categories: human resources, governance, internal culture and organizational practice, communications, fundraising, and public engagement, programming, and lastly, work plan development and implementation, because our intention is for this to be an iterative process and an indefinite one. There will always be more to do in terms of furthering anti-racism and anti-oppression. Our next challenge will be to start to develop concrete strategies and actions, as well as goals, indicators, and targets, so that we have ways to actually hold ourselves accountable to making progress on these commitments. And beyond our own internal processes, we're invested in the progress of our sector as a whole. ARC gives us a platform with which to learn from one another, but also to make our efforts meaningful on a larger scale. I think there's always a balance to be struck between looking inwards and holding ourselves accountable and finding ways to work in solidarity and in coalition, as we do in all our political work, to pursue change on a greater level. So as I reflect on this journey and where we are now, I have 3 lessons that I will share to wrap up. Firstly, being a values-led organization, even one that espouses intersectional feminism, doesn't confer automatic shared clarity about how to live out and implement as an institution anti-racism and anti-oppression. We can't take our anti-racism for granted. We can't assume that we are not complicit in colonialism, in systemic racism, in white supremacy, nor can we ever rest on our laurels and pat ourselves on the back for a job well done. There will always be more work. 2, it's an ongoing journey. Even if we make strides, things will always evolve. We will always need to keep learning and growing. And we will always be engaged in unlearning systemic oppression for as long as we are people living within it. So I appreciated, Odette, that you said at the outset that this work requires much humility, much openness, and that's something we're always challenging ourselves to embrace. And finally, if the people who have the most influence on an organization's institutional practices come from dominant backgrounds, then their ignorance, whether it's intentional or not, will be reflected in how the organization develops practices in the organization structures. I always say that InterPariss practices non-hierarchy, but we exist in a hierarchical world. And there remain power imbalances within the organization because of that. And that will continue to perpetuate within internal processes and the decisions we make unless explicitly and effortfully challenged. Other perspectives are needed to see what needs to be changed, whether these come from voices that have been previously ignored or sidelined, from external actors, and from our allies within the sector, which is why spaces like this space today is so valuable. So I will leave it there for now, and I'll look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Yet another really, really interesting, different, as you said, quite unique presentation on InterPariss trajectory, and quite hopeful because you're really speaking to the length of time, sort of the ongoingness of the time that it takes, but also, and so the relentlessness that is required in this work, creativity, relentlessness, the openness. But also what's very inspiring too is hearing about the different milestones that have been hit and have been exciting for you, but have also challenged you and the team. So that's lots to unpack there.